So, returning to what we were talking about, we have physical characteristics that all humans have because we have a shared biological ancestry. We are, for instance, we can see in the daytime, but we can't see very well at night, which means that we're diurnal. This is something that almost every primate is diurnal. It's active during the daytime. But imagine how different our culture would be if we were nocturnal creatures, that we slept during the day and could see in the dark, and that would change the way that we behave. So there are some underlying physiological universal features that we have that all humans share because we are all humans. So we all have certain biological, psychological, social, cultural features that are found in every culture. And these are what we call universals, cultural universals. But the way that you fulfill those universal needs, those universal characteristics, are what we call particularities. So the particulars are things that in ethnography analyzes. So you gather data on the particular behaviors and patterns of a certain group and the way that they adapt those to meet those universal needs in the environment that they find themselves in. So you're going to have some broad similarities between, let's say, a desert living culture in North America and a desert living culture in Asia and a desert living culture in Africa. Same goes for coastal communities. There's going to be some broad similarities in the way that you meet those universal requirements. But in the particulars, they're going to be you're going to find differences between them. So a Gobi desert culture is going to be different from a Saharan desert culture, different from a Mojave desert culture. So each particular culture, you gather data on the way that the cultural universals are met by those particular human groups. But you can gather patterns that are what we call the generalities. And so desert cultures, arid climate cultures, are going to have similar, they might very well have similar general patterns. But this applies to all of the particular institutions within a culture as well, that you can compare and contrast the general patterns. So, for instance, what is a family, right? What do you think of a family? A family is. This is a universal that all humans have to have some system of creating offspring, of having children. But it's ethnocentric to consider the way that you do things the only way or the best way or the proper way. So in this country, we tend to prioritize, for instance, the nuclear family, that is to say a mother, a father, and the children that all live in the household. But is that the only way of doing things? No, that's one of a general pattern of how you organize a family group and how you reproduce offspring. There are other ways of organizing your communities that meet that universal need of creating offspring and raising them in your group, right? So the concept that we use is ethnocentricity, which means that you're only looking at things through your own perspective and considering that to be either the proper way or the best way. That's something that we want to avoid in anthropology because that skews and biases our interpretations. We want to look at the emic. We want to understand how people understand their behaviors within the context of their own cultures, not by superimposing our values and our system upon another group's behaviors. So these cultural particulars that you see all across the world by gathering ethnographies together can be compared to one another and lumped into general categories. And it's also kind of interesting for yourself. You can understand what general pattern your lifestyle and your behaviors fit as well. So this isn't just examining the other. This isn't just examining, far-flung places around the world and seeing how they do things. It's also, you can turn this upon yourself and see how your behaviors fit into certain particular or general categories and fulfill certain universal needs. Now, how does culture form? Well, as I mentioned before, it forms in your brain, but it's not created by you and you alone. It's part of an interaction between you and others in a community. And this is something we're going to consider a little bit later when we look at anthropological theory between the concept of structure and agency. That you are an agent. You are someone who participates in cultural practices. You are not just participating, but you are contributing to its construction. Now, your contributions can be additive, they can be reinforcing. You can accept the culture that you're part of, or you can be an agent of change, or of resistance, or of rule breaking. Whatever you do, you are part of that structure because you were brought up as an infant to learn the language, to learn the behaviors, to learn the patterns, to learn the structures, to learn the rules. Now, you don't have to follow the rules, but you do have to learn them in order to participate in that culture. So even if you're trying to tear down a culture, you're still a participant of it. And so humans have the ability to avoid, manipulate, subvert, and change rules and patterns in your own culture as an agent. So you are operating within a structure which you don't control. You didn't choose to be born into a family or a culture. That was imposed upon you from the accident of your birth. But the way that you participate in it is something that you choose. And culture is always contested. This is not something that being a sort of an agent for change is not necessarily an anomaly. It's a feature, not a bug. Culture is constantly a push and a pull between people that want to maintain a structure and those that want to change it into something else. There is a constant tension in culture that is moving between what you already understand and what you participate in. And this is the tension between an agent, an active agent like yourself, and the structure that you exist within. And for anthropologists sometimes find it useful to distinguish between an idealized culture, one that might be described as like a constant or a traditional culture, and which have descriptions that are normative and say, this is someone might describe to you a normal way of life. But that may be very different from the lived experience or the differential experiences of different people. And the real culture, as opposed to the ideal culture, can be both described by the anthropologist. So the anthropologist can say, here is what somebody's perception of the idealized culture is, the structure, but here's the actual lived experience. And that's where, once again, the etic perspective that the anthropologist is employing is useful for objectively describing this lived experience. Culture also is not just an everyday, day-to-day sort of a thing too. It can be much larger than that. And you can have multiple identities, multiple cultures running simultaneously. So think about it yourself. You are of a particular age group. You have a particular gender. You live in a particular part of the country. You might have a particular economic background. You might have a particular national background or ethnic background. You might have a religion. You might have a hobby or an interest. You go to college. That puts you in another bracket. So levels of culture can be multi-layered and nested. National culture represents things like experiences, beliefs, learned behavioral patterns, values, and institutions that are shared by citizens of that same nation. But you can also even have international cultures that are practices that extend beyond and across national boundaries. Also, within these groups, you can have subcultures that are identifiable cultural patterns and traditions associated with groups within the same complex society, particular groups within that society. And acquiring knowledge of this of a culture and becoming a participant of it can take place by different means. We'll explore some of those ways that happens in later chapters, but some of the mechanisms for cultural change are things like autochthonous development. Like you can develop a culture as an indigenous group that comes from your own original expression of identity. That's possible, of course. But there's never been a culture that doesn't have a neighbor, that doesn't interact with the next group over. So there's always, you can't think of cultures as little islands that exist and don't interact with anyone else. Even when you talk about like these very remote groups of people in Amazonia or in Micronesia, they still know who their neighbors are. They still have interactions with other humans that aren't their group. It's just that they're not plugged into the global international world. So all cultures experience some amount of what we call diffusion, which is the spread of cultural traits through borrowing between cultures. And that's always been the case throughout human history. And it can be done through down the line. It can be between group A and group B, or it can be between group A and group C with an intermediary B in the middle. So it can be down the line in that sense. And with each passing intermediary, that message and that culture may be diluted through different factors. And so the transmission may be altered as it moves along. Diffusion can also be forced upon people, so diffusion can be subjugating and imposed, as well as emulated and desired as well. Also, acculturation, I should say enculturation, enculturation, is when you grow up learning concepts. But acculturation, ACC, culturation, ACCULTURATION, is the exchange of cultural features when groups come into continuous first-hand contact. And this is something where you can develop blends, you can acquire characteristics, you can emulate those characteristics, and also there can be independent inventions that aren't explained by diffusion as well. And also, in today's very connected world, there is globalization, that you don't have to necessarily be having first-hand contact with another group to acquire cultural influence. You can get online and learn all about Japanese culture and never meet a Japanese person or someone from Japan. And that also takes on its own directions, that third-hand or globalized culture can take on its own form that is different from first-hand acquired cultural influences as well. Globalization is a fact in the sense that we have communication and spread and connectedness of production, communication, technology, exchange, resources all across the world. This is the primary use of the word that we're going to use in this class. When we say globalization, it's a fact, right? That we are connected globally. But globalization is also a contested ideology, one where people are pushing back against these influences that you see spreading. And we'll look at that a little bit later on in a future chapter, specifically on globalization, colonial, post-colonial studies, and that sort of a thing. And also in the context of the economics and policy making. So that's all I want to say for chapter 2. I'll catch you for the next chapter. See you then.